It all started when I received the letter. The HOA, with its usual air of self-importance, had decided it was time to evict me from my own property. They cited the usual vague rules about property aesthetics and an imaginary neighborhood harmony that somehow I was failing to contribute to. My neighbors, most of whom I barely knew, were all in on it. The letter was a formal notice that my house was not up to the standards they had set, a polite way of saying they wanted me out. For weeks, I had been receiving petty complaints about my garden, the color of my fence, and even the size of my mailbox. But now they had crossed a line, and I wasn't going to take it lying down. At first, I was tempted to fight back by writing a letter of my own, politely refusing to comply, as I had done with every ridiculous request they made. But this time, something about the situation felt different. The HOA was acting like it owned the entire neighborhood, like they had the right to control every detail of my life. It wasn't just about the rules anymore. It was personal. I could feel it. They wanted to break me, humiliate me, and remove me as a thorn in their side. I'd been living in this house for over a decade. I had worked hard to make it mine, paying my mortgage on time, keeping it in good shape, and treating it like the sanctuary it was. But that was never enough for the HOA. They saw me as an outsider, someone who didn't play by their rules, someone they needed to get rid of. I was a problem they needed to solve. But what they didn't know was that I had a secret weapon. People often underestimated me. I didn't look like the kind of person who could fight a war, much less take on a whole HOA board. I didn't have a high-powered lawyer or a team of advocates behind me. I was just a regular person, going about my life, minding my own business. But the thing they didn't know was that I had a background in legal matters. I wasn't some random homeowner. They had no idea that I had worked for years as a paralegal, working in real estate law. I knew the ins and outs of property rights, zoning laws, and everything the HOA was relying on to control the neighborhood. They thought they could bulldoze me, but they had no idea that I was about to bulldoze them. The first thing I did was gather every piece of paperwork I had on my property. I went through every file I had carefully saved over the years: permit applications, inspection reports, property surveys, and any correspondence with the HOA. I knew I had to make sure everything was legally sound before I made my move. There was one thing I learned quickly. The HOA had no idea how many rules they were violating themselves. They thought they could push me around, but they had no idea they were playing with fire. Next, I started documenting every interaction I had with the HOA. I recorded every meeting, took notes on every letter they sent me, and started compiling a detailed log of their actions. Every time they tried to threaten me with fines or violations, I was there, keeping track, building my case. It didn't take long before I realized that they were using their position of power for personal gain. The HOA president, in particular, had been using his authority to push for changes that directly benefited his own property value. I knew I had them now, but I didn't just want to play defense. I wanted to go on offense. I called in favors from a few old contacts, some lawyers I had worked with over the years. I didn't need a high-powered legal team. I needed a few people who knew how to deal with corrupt organizations, people who had experience with housing regulations and tenant rights. Together, we began looking into the HOA's financial records, board meetings, and bylaws. The more we dug, the more we found. The HOA president had been involved in several shady dealings over the years, using his position to manipulate neighborhood policies for his personal gain. Then, the real breakthrough came. I discovered that the HOA board had been making illegal decisions for years, violating state and federal housing laws. I wasn't just going to fight them off, I was going to bring them down. The first piece of the puzzle was a simple zoning violation. It turned out that the HOA president had failed to file the correct paperwork for several renovations to his property, including a fence that was over the legal height limit. That was my key to launching my attack. I wasn't going to just defend myself. I was going to expose them all. The HOA had underestimated me, and now it was time to show them that I wasn't just a homeowner. They were about to learn that I had the power to bring the entire system crashing down. The next step was to put everything into motion. Armed with my newfound knowledge and my network of legal contacts, I started laying out my plan. The HOA had been making critical errors for years, and now I had the proof I needed to not only defend myself, but to strike back in a way they would never expect. I filed a formal complaint with the local government, highlighting the multiple violations they had made, starting with the zoning infractions committed by the HOA president himself. The more I looked into it, the more I realized that their entire structure was built on a foundation of lies and half-truths. Every piece of property the HOA had ever touched had been affected by their misconduct, but they had always managed to silence the complaints with threats and intimidation. This time, things would be different. I wasn't just going to sit quietly and hope the issue resolved itself. I was going to take it to the next level. I started reaching out to my neighbors, the ones who had been affected by the HOA's power trips. I spoke to people who had been fined for trivial things like keeping their lawn a few inches too long or installing a small vegetable garden. It turns out I wasn't the only one who had been harassed. A few of my neighbors had been too intimidated to fight back, but many of them were fed up with the way the HOA had been treating them. I spent hours listening to their stories, documenting their experiences, and compiling a list of the HOA's most egregious actions. Each neighbor's testimony became a weapon I could use in my fight. As I continued building my case, I started getting more bold. I called local reporters and set up interviews, carefully choosing the ones who were known for digging deep into stories. I knew that the media attention could escalate this situation quickly, and I needed the HOA to feel the pressure. The more attention I brought to their illegal activities, the more the HOA would crumble under the weight of their own corruption. I knew they were used to operating in the shadows, hiding behind their rules and regulations. But this time, they weren't going to get away with it. The breaking point came when I was invited to a community meeting held by the HOA. I had planned to attend as just another frustrated homeowner, but instead, I showed up with a stack of evidence that could bring their entire operation to its knees. I arrived early and made sure to document every little detail: who was present, what was being discussed, and how they treated everyone. It wasn't long before the board members realized something was different about me. I didn't just complain. I came prepared. I had an arsenal of legal documents, violation records, and even video footage that exposed the HOA's corrupt activities. At first, they tried to dismiss me, but as I laid out each violation they had committed, their faces slowly turned pale. The room grew silent, and the weight of the truth began to settle in. But I wasn't done. I had one final move to make. I reached out to state investigators who specialized in housing law violations and discrimination. I shared the extensive evidence I had compiled, including the illegal practices of the HOA board and the president's own personal conflicts of interest. The response was swift. Within days, investigators arrived at my house, and I was informed that they would be conducting a full investigation into the HOA's actions. It wasn't long before the news cameras arrived, and the story of the corrupt HOA began to make headlines. As the story gained traction, the HOA's grip on the neighborhood started to slip. Neighbors who had been too scared to speak up began to rally around me, showing their support and sharing their own experiences. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for the entire community. The more people I spoke to, the more I realized how deep the HOA's corruption ran. They had been using their position of power to manipulate everyone, from the most vulnerable residents to the wealthiest homeowners. But now the tables had turned. The media spotlight had shifted, and the HOA was being exposed for what it truly was: a bully that thrived on fear and intimidation. The final straw came when the HOA president was caught trying to tamper with official documents in a last-ditch attempt to cover up his wrongdoings. It didn't take long for the investigators to connect the dots, and soon enough, he was facing charges. His reign of terror had come to an abrupt end. But that wasn't the end of the story. Once the HOA was dismantled, the community began to rebuild. The new board, which was formed after the corruption was exposed, worked hard to ensure that the mistakes of the past were never repeated. Instead of fining residents for petty infractions, they focused on creating a supportive environment where everyone's voice was heard. The transformation in the neighborhood was astounding. No longer did residents live in fear of arbitrary fines and rule enforcement. People started coming together, organizing social events, and offering support to one another. The community, once divided by fear and resentment, was now united in solidarity. And as for me, I had not only survived the HOA's attempts to push me out, but I had also become a catalyst for change. I had taken down a corrupt system, exposed their illegal practices, and empowered my neighbors to stand up for their rights. It was a victory I could never have imagined when the HOA first targeted me. They thought they could evict me, but in the end, it was they who were evicted from power. With the HOA president gone and the once fearsome board members now facing scrutiny, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. What had once felt like an oppressive dictatorship now began to feel like a community again. The first meeting of the newly formed board was a turning point. Residents who had previously stayed quiet came forward to share their ideas for a better neighborhood. The focus was no longer on petty rules and punishments, but on building a space where everyone felt welcome and respected. The changes were immediate, starting with the most basic of things. No longer would anyone fear receiving a violation notice for the smallest of infractions. The new board set up a help desk for homeowners, where they could ask questions, report issues, or even suggest improvements. The transformation from a hostile environment to one of support and cooperation was incredible. I couldn't believe how quickly everything had turned around. What had once felt like a battleground now felt like home again. People were smiling more, engaging in conversations they'd previously avoided, and the daily tension that had once existed between neighbors faded into the background. And it wasn't just the people who felt the shift. Even the property values, which had been under pressure from the relentless HOA rules, began to rise. The new sense of freedom in the neighborhood was palpable, and it showed in the vibrant, thriving community that was starting to emerge. The best part of this transformation was seeing the long-term impact. I had always known that standing up against the HOA was about more than just protecting my own home. It was about giving everyone the chance to live without fear. But the changes didn't stop with the new board and the revamped neighborhood. The ripple effect of what had happened in our little corner of the world spread far beyond our street. Other homeowners in nearby neighborhoods, who had been dealing with their own oppressive HOAs, began reaching out for advice. They'd seen what had happened here and wanted to know how they could make a change in their own communities. It felt like a wave of empowerment had washed over the entire area. As for the HOA's former leader, his downfall had not been swift enough for him to escape the consequences of his actions. Not only had he been stripped of his position, but the investigation into his financial dealings revealed more corruption than anyone could have imagined. It turned out he had been funneling funds from the HOA into his own personal business ventures. The more the investigation uncovered, the more the community realized how deep the rot had gone. The public exposure of his actions not only ended his reign, but also sent a message to other HOA leaders in the region. They were not untouchable. News of the scandal spread beyond the local community. Local news stations picked up the story, and soon enough, our neighborhood was making headlines across the state. The story of how a group of ordinary homeowners stood up to a corrupt HOA and took down their leader became a symbol of resistance. It was a reminder that even the smallest group of people could take on the biggest powers if they stood together. The public outcry against the abuses of power in HOAs grew louder, and before long, new laws were being introduced to regulate HOA actions more strictly. The momentum from our victory sparked changes in policy that would help protect homeowners from overbearing HOA rules and prevent future corruption. Through all of this, I realized something profound. The fight against the HOA wasn't just about winning a battle. It was about reclaiming our community. The real victory was seeing the way neighbors who had once been divided now stood united. I saw it in the way people worked together to fix up common areas and how they offered support to the elderly residents who had been too afraid to speak up before. The sense of community that had been stifled for so long was now flourishing. People were engaged in the life of the neighborhood, and there was a genuine feeling of camaraderie that hadn't existed before. And as I watched the old, corrupt HOA crumble and a new, more compassionate system rise in its place, I couldn't help but feel proud. Not just of what we had accomplished, but of the future we were creating. A future where we didn't just sit back and let bullies run the show, but where we took control of our own destinies and built something better together. It wasn't the easy path, and it wasn't without its struggles, but the reward was more than worth it. We had stood up to the system, and in doing so, we had changed it forever. By the time the dust had settled, it was clear that the victory wasn't just mine. It belonged to everyone who had stood up, everyone who had fought for a better community, and everyone who had refused to let fear dictate their lives. Our neighborhood, once a place of tension and fear, had been transformed into a place of support and solidarity. The power of a united community, standing up for what was right, had proven to be unstoppable. And as I stood there, watching the sunset over a neighborhood that had reclaimed its soul, I knew that this was just the beginning. We had made history, not just in our neighborhood, but in the fight for justice and fairness in our society. And now, we were stronger than ever.